I was sitting in my own dining room on Christmas morning, watching my daughter-in-law Rebecca roll her eyes at the homemade apple pie I'd spent 3 hours making, when I realized I'd become the family ATM that nobody bothered to thank. The $847,000 mortgage I'd been quietly paying for their dream house in Westfield, Connecticut for the past 4 years had apparently earned me a pair of gas station socks and a lecture about how my old-fashioned cooking wasn't what they were used to. That's when I knew this Christmas was going to be very different from any they'd experienced before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Patricia Brennan, and at 68 years old, I thought I understood what family meant. For most of my life, that understanding had served me well. I'd built a successful accounting practice in Hartford, Connecticut, working 60-hour weeks for 35 years to accumulate the kind of wealth that could provide security not just for myself, but for the people I loved. My late husband Robert and I had been careful with money, strategic about investments, and generous with our success when it mattered. Robert passed away 6 years ago after a brief but aggressive battle with pancreatic cancer. In those final months, as we sat in oncology waiting rooms and planned for a future I'd have to navigate alone, we'd talked extensively about legacy. Not just the financial kind, but the emotional inheritance we'd leave behind. Robert had been adamant about one thing: family takes care of family. "Patty," he'd said during one of our last serious conversations, "we've been blessed with more than we need. When the time comes, don't hesitate to help Michael build his life. That's what parents do." Michael is our only child, born when I was 29 and Robert was 32. We'd tried for years to have children, going through fertility treatments and heartbreak before Michael finally arrived like a miracle we'd almost stopped believing in. Perhaps because he came so late, or perhaps because he remained our only child, we may have spoiled him more than we should have. Robert and I provided Michael with private school education, summer camps, college tuition at Northwestern University, and a master's degree in business administration that cost more than most people's houses. Michael graduated with excellent grades and big dreams. He landed a position at a consulting firm in Manhattan, met Rebecca Walsh at a networking event, and within 2 years had proposed with a ring that cost more than my first car. Rebecca was beautiful, ambitious, and came from a family that valued success above almost everything else. Her father, James Walsh, owned a chain of high-end restaurants across Fairfield County. Her mother, Linda, was a former real estate agent who now spent her time organizing charity galas and country club events. They were the kind of people who measured worth by postal codes and car brands. The wedding was elegant, expensive, and everything Rebecca had dreamed of. Robert and I contributed significantly to the costs, happy to see Michael so radiant on what should have been one of the happiest days of his life. But even then, I noticed small things that gave me pause. Rebecca's obvious disappointment that we hadn't offered to pay for the entire wedding. Her suggestions that perhaps we should update our look for the photographs. The way she'd mention other parents who'd given their children houses as wedding gifts, always with a casual tone that felt anything but casual. Still, I attributed these moments to wedding stress and the natural adjustment period that comes with merging two families with different financial situations. Rebecca wasn't malicious, I told myself. She was just young and accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Michael was happy, and that happiness felt like validation of every sacrifice Robert and I had made to provide him with opportunities we'd never had. The first few years of their marriage unfolded predictably. Michael and Rebecca rented a beautiful apartment in Greenwich Village, close enough to Michael's job that he could walk to work, expensive enough that it required most of his salary to maintain. Rebecca worked part-time at an art gallery in Soho, a position that provided more social connections than actual income. They traveled frequently, dined at restaurants I couldn't pronounce, and seemed to be living the sophisticated urban lifestyle that Rebecca had always envisioned. But I began to notice the subtle signs of financial strain during family dinners. Credit card receipts left carelessly on tables, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms, the way Michael would check his phone obsessively during meals, his face tightening with what I recognized as the expression of someone monitoring bank balances and due dates. Rebecca's increasing mentions of friends who lived in houses rather than apartments, who had yards and guest rooms and space to entertain properly. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon in October, almost 3 years after their wedding. Michael and Rebecca had come to my house in West Hartford for dinner, a weekly tradition Robert and I had established and that I'd maintained after his death. The house, a colonial built in 1987 that Robert and I had purchased when Michael was in high school, sat on 2 acres of carefully maintained property. It was too large for me alone, but it held 40 years of memories and represented the stability I'd craved since losing Robert. We were sitting in my living room after dinner, Michael helping himself to a second piece of the chocolate cake that had been his favorite since childhood, when Rebecca began talking about their friend's recent house purchase in Westfield. "The Hendersons just bought the most amazing place," she said, her voice carrying the kind of wistful enthusiasm that I'd learned to recognize as prelude to a request. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen with granite countertops, and a backyard that's perfect for entertaining. It's exactly the kind of place where we could start a family properly. Michael shot her a look that I pretended not to notice, but Rebecca continued. Of course, they had help with the down payment. Mr. Henderson's parents basically bought the house outright and let them pay it back over time. No bank involved, no credit checks, no stress about qualifying for a mortgage, with student loans still hanging over their heads. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. I set down my coffee cup and looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be independent and responsible, who is now sitting in my living room while his wife not so subtly suggested that I should finance their transition from apartment dwellers to homeowners. "That's generous of the Hendersons' parents," I said carefully, giving Michael an opportunity to redirect the conversation or clarify that this wasn't a request. Instead, he leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd been building up to this conversation for weeks. "Mom, Rebecca and I have been talking about our future. We want to start a family, but the apartment just isn't practical for children. We need more space, a yard, a place where kids can play safely." "That makes sense," I agreed. "The housing market is strong right now. Have you started looking at what you can qualify for?" Rebecca's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Patricia, we've been looking for months. Do you know what kind of house we can afford on Michael's salary with our student loan debt? A 2-bedroom ranch in a neighborhood where I wouldn't feel safe walking to my car. Places where the school systems are underfunded and the property values are declining." I felt the familiar tension that accompanied discussions about money in families where resources were unevenly distributed. "Financial planning takes time," I offered. "Perhaps if you started with a smaller place and built equity." "Or," Rebecca interrupted, her voice taking on the edge of someone who'd rehearsed this speech, "we could explore creative financing options. Family mortgages are becoming more common. Parents help their children purchase homes by acting as the bank. Everyone benefits. The kids get the house they need, the parents get a better return on their investment than they'd see in savings accounts." Michael jumped in quickly, perhaps sensing my surprise at Rebecca's directness. "It would be a legitimate business arrangement, Mom. We'd draw up proper contracts, make monthly payments, handle all the legal documentation professionally. You wouldn't be giving us anything. You'd be making an investment that provides you with steady income." I looked at my son, this man who'd graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, who worked for a consulting firm that paid him well enough to afford Manhattan rent, who was asking me to become his mortgage company because traditional banks apparently found his financial situation insufficient for the lifestyle his wife demanded. "What kind of house are you considering?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer would be far beyond what any reasonable financial planner would recommend for someone in Michael's position. Rebecca's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting weeks for this opening. "There's a beautiful colonial in Westfield that just came on the market. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, updated kitchen, finished basement, 2-car garage, and the most gorgeous landscaping. It's in the top school district in Fairfield County, walking distance to the train station, and the neighborhood is just perfect for raising children." "How much?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that the specifics almost didn't matter. Whatever the amount, it would be more than Michael and Rebecca could afford on their own, which meant any family mortgage I provided would be less about helping them transition into homeownership and more about enabling them to live beyond their means. $847,000, Michael said quickly, as if saying the number fast would make it seem less staggering. I felt my breath catch. $847,000 was more than most people in America would earn in their entire lifetimes. It was more than Robert and I had paid for our house, our cars, and Michael's entire education combined. It was the kind of money that represented decades of careful saving and strategic investing. I began, then stopped myself from finishing the sentence. That's insane. That's more than you can afford. That's not an investment, it's enabling financial irresponsibility. I know it sounds like a lot, Rebecca said, misinterpreting my pause as hesitation rather than shock. But Patricia, you have to think about this strategically. Property values in Westfield have increased by 30% over the past 5 years. Even if you charged us below market interest rates, you'd still see better returns than anything you're getting from your financial advisor. Plus, you'd be helping Michael and me build the kind of life where we can give you grandchildren and create the family memories that really matter. The mention of grandchildren felt calculated, designed to appeal to emotions rather than logic. I looked at Michael, searching his face for some sign that he recognized the magnitude of what they were asking. Some acknowledgement that requesting nearly $1 million from his recently widowed mother might be presumptuous. Instead, I saw hope mixed with desperation. The expression of someone who'd convinced himself that this request was reasonable because the alternative, living within his actual means, felt like failure. I need to think about this, I said finally. Rebecca's smile faltered slightly. Of course. We're not asking for an answer tonight. But Patricia, the house won't stay on the market long. Properties like this in neighborhoods like Westfield get multiple offers within days. If we're going to move forward, we'd need to know soon. After they left that evening, I sat alone in my quiet house and tried to process what had just happened. My son and his wife, neither of whom had ever asked about my financial situation or expressed interest in my retirement planning, had just requested that I finance a lifestyle I wasn't sure they deserved, and definitely couldn't afford on their own. Part of me wanted to dismiss the request immediately. $847,000 wasn't play money, even for someone in my financial position. It represented security, independence, the ability to handle unexpected medical expenses or economic downturns without depending on anyone else. But another part of me remembered Robert's words about family taking care of family. We had been fortunate enough to accumulate wealth beyond our personal needs. Michael was our only child, and eventually, everything I owned would become his inheritance anyway. If I could help him build a stable foundation for his family while I was alive to see the benefits, wasn't that exactly what Robert would have wanted? Over the following weeks, I found myself researching family mortgages, consulting with my financial advisor, and trying to determine whether this request was reasonable or manipulative. The numbers were straightforward enough. I could afford to make this loan without compromising my own financial security. The legal framework existed to structure such arrangements properly. Other families navigated similar situations successfully. What troubled me wasn't the logistics but the underlying assumptions. Michael and Rebecca seemed to believe that my wealth obligated me to finance their lifestyle choices. They'd approached the conversation not as supplicants requesting a favor, but as adults negotiating a business arrangement that I should be grateful to participate in. Still, 3 weeks after their initial request, I called Michael and told him I was willing to move forward. The relief in his voice was immediate and overwhelming. "Mom, you have no idea what this means to us. Rebecca is going to be so excited. We can finally start building the life we've been dreaming about." I hired an attorney to draft proper mortgage documents, established escrow accounts for taxes and insurance, and structured the loan with terms that protected both parties. Michael and Rebecca would make monthly payments of $4,200, which covered principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. I charged them 4.5% interest, below market rates, but sufficient to provide me with reasonable returns on the investment. The closing took place on a snowy Friday morning in December. I watched Michael and Rebecca sign documents that made them homeowners of a property they couldn't have afforded without my assistance, and I felt the complex mixture of pride and apprehension that accompanies most major financial decisions. They moved into their Westfield colonial 2 weeks before Christmas, and I helped them settle in by providing additional funds for immediate necessities, a security system, window treatments, and basic landscaping maintenance. These weren't part of our mortgage agreement, but they seemed like reasonable investments in protecting the property that now secured my loan. For the first year, everything proceeded smoothly. Michael and Rebecca made their monthly payments on time, invited me for dinner in their beautiful new home, and seemed genuinely grateful for the opportunity I'd provided. Rebecca had quit her part-time gallery job to focus on making the house a real home, which apparently required extensive shopping for furniture, artwork, and decorative accessories that transformed their space into something resembling a magazine spread. I told myself that their obvious happiness validated my decision to help them. They hosted elegant dinner parties, joined the country club, and began talking seriously about starting a family. Rebecca had made friends with other young wives in the neighborhood, women who didn't work but stayed busy with yoga classes, charity committees, and elaborate home improvement projects. But gradually, subtly, I began to notice changes in how Michael and Rebecca interacted with me. The gratitude that had been so evident during our early conversations about the house began to fade, replaced by something that felt more like entitlement. They spoke about their house without acknowledging that I owned it. They made major decisions about renovations and improvements without consulting me, even though such changes affected the value of my investment. Most troubling was the way Rebecca began treating me during family gatherings. Where she'd once been deferential, even slightly intimidated by my financial position, she now spoke to me with the casual dismissiveness typically reserved for elderly relatives whose opinions no longer mattered much. The shift became unmistakable during Michael's birthday dinner last spring. I'd offered to cook his favorite meal, pot roast with all the traditional sides he'd grown up loving, but Rebecca had laughed and suggested we upgrade to something more sophisticated. She'd made reservations at an expensive restaurant in Greenwich, the kind of place where entrees cost more than most families spend on groceries for a week. During dinner, Rebecca had monopolized the conversation with stories about their neighbors' vacation homes and luxury car purchases, painting a picture of a social circle where my son and his wife were barely keeping up financially despite living in a house I'd purchased for them. The Andersons just bought a summer place in the Hamptons, Rebecca had said, cutting her $65 steak with practiced efficiency. Nothing too extravagant, just a 4-bedroom cottage with private beach access. They're having a housewarming party next month. Michael had shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That sounds nice. It is nice. These are the kinds of people we should be socializing with, Michael. Successful people, who can open doors for your career, who understand what it means to live well. Rebecca had glanced at me briefly, as if remembering I was paying for this dinner, and the lifestyle that made it possible. Of course, we're so grateful to be part of this community. Not everyone is fortunate enough to have family support that makes this kind of life possible. The comment had stung not because it was untrue, but because it felt like an afterthought, a perfunctory acknowledgement designed to cover the fact that Rebecca had been discussing their lifestyle as if they'd achieved it independently. As I drove home that night, I'd found myself questioning whether my generosity had been wise or simply enabled my son and his wife to live beyond their means while taking my contributions for granted. That questioning would prove to be just the beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Like most revelations about people we love, it crept in through small moments that individually seemed insignificant but collectively painted a picture I'd been too generous to see clearly. It started with the renovations. 6 months after moving into their Westfield colonial, Rebecca began what she called essential updates to make the house truly livable. The kitchen, which had been renovated by the previous owners just 3 years earlier, apparently wasn't up to Rebecca's standards for entertaining. The master bathroom needed a complete overhaul to achieve the spa-like atmosphere she'd seen in design magazines. The basement required finishing to create a proper home office for Michael, and a media room for the family they were planning to start. None of these projects were discussed with me beforehand, despite the fact that I owned the property and any modifications affected the value of my investment. I learned about them the same way I learned most things about Michael and Rebecca's life now, through casual mentions during our increasingly infrequent phone calls or discovery during my monthly visits to their home. The contractors are here again, I observed during a Sunday dinner in March, noting the construction vehicles in their driveway and the plastic sheeting covering what had once been a perfectly functional kitchen. Oh, that, Rebecca said with a wave of her hand, as if spending tens of thousands of dollars on unnecessary renovations was as routine as buying groceries. We decided the kitchen layout just wasn't working for our lifestyle. The island was too small for serious cooking, and the cabinet storage was completely inadequate for someone who actually uses their kitchen for more than reheating takeout. The implication that the previous kitchen had been somehow deficient stung, particularly since I'd admired its granite countertops and professional-grade appliances during our house hunting visits. But more concerning was Rebecca's casual assumption that major structural changes to my property were decisions she could make unilaterally. "How are you financing these improvements?" I asked, genuinely curious about where they'd found money for renovations when their monthly budget was already stretched to accommodate their mortgage payments, country club membership, and Rebecca's increasingly expensive social obligations. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We took out a home equity line of credit. The house has already appreciated enough to support additional borrowing, and the improvements will increase the property value even more." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. They'd taken out a second mortgage on my property without discussing it with me, using the equity I'd created through my initial investment to fund lifestyle upgrades that benefited them but increased my financial risk. "I wish you'd mentioned that before proceeding," I said carefully. "As the primary mortgage holder, I have a legitimate interest in any additional liens against the property." Rebecca's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Patricia, you're not really the mortgage holder in any traditional sense. This is a family arrangement, not a business transaction. Besides, everything we're doing increases the value of your investment. You should be thanking us for improving your property." The casual arrogance of her response left me speechless. In Rebecca's mind, my $847,000 loan had apparently transformed from generous financial assistance into an obligation I should be grateful to provide. The house had become their property, improved with their money, despite the fact that every dollar they'd borrowed against the equity was secured by my initial investment. But it wasn't just the financial presumption that troubled me. It was the subtle but unmistakable shift in how they treated me personally. Where conversations had once included genuine interest in my life, my health, my activities, they now felt perfunctory, checkbox exercises in family obligation. Rebecca would ask about my volunteer work at the literacy center, with the glazed expression of someone waiting for a pause in conversation to redirect toward more interesting topics. Michael would inquire about my book club meetings or garden projects with obvious impatience, clearly eager to move on to discussions about their social calendar, vacation plans, or latest home improvement schemes. During one particularly telling conversation in April, I'd mentioned that I was considering downsizing to a smaller house, something more manageable for someone my age living alone. "That's probably smart," Rebecca had agreed immediately. "This place is way too big for one person. You could probably get a nice condo somewhere, maybe one of those senior communities with activities and meal plans. Much more practical." What struck me wasn't her agreement with my potential downsizing, that was reasonable enough, but her immediate leap to assumptions about where I should live. Senior communities with meal plans. As if my financial independence and personal preferences were irrelevant now that I'd proven useful as their private mortgage company. Michael had been quieter during this conversation, but I could see him calculating. If I sold my house, the proceeds could potentially fund additional investments in their lifestyle. Perhaps a vacation home, or funding for Rebecca to start the interior design business she'd been discussing with her country club friends. The most painful realization came during Michael's 35th birthday celebration in May. Rebecca had organized what she called an intimate gathering, 30 people at their house for a catered dinner that probably cost more than most families spend on food in 2 months. I had offered to contribute by making Michael's favorite dessert, the chocolate bourbon cake that had been a family tradition since he was 8 years old. Rebecca had accepted my offer with the kind of gracious smile typically reserved for well-meaning elderly relatives whose contributions needed to be managed carefully. "That's so sweet, Patricia. Just make sure it's not too rich. Several of our guests have dietary restrictions, and we want everyone to feel included." I'd spent an entire Saturday perfecting the cake, using premium ingredients and the family recipe I'd refined over decades of birthday celebrations. When I arrived at their party carrying my contribution, Rebecca had thanked me with obvious relief. "Oh good, you brought the cake. You can put it in the kitchen. I'll make sure the caterers know to serve it alongside the other desserts they brought." Other desserts. As if my homemade birthday cake for my own son was one option among many, rather than the centerpiece of his celebration. But the real revelation came when I overheard Rebecca talking to her friend Jennifer in the powder room near the kitchen. I'd gone to check whether my cake needed to be moved to make room for the caterer's equipment when I heard my name through the partially open door. "Patricia made one of her homemade cakes," Rebecca was saying with barely concealed exasperation. "It's sweet that she wants to contribute, but honestly, it's so awkward having to serve grocery store ingredients next to professionally prepared desserts. These people are used to a certain standard." "Can't you just not serve it?" Jennifer had asked. "Of course not. She's Michael's mother, and she paid for this house. I have to pretend her amateur baking fits with the rest of the evening. It's just part of managing family relationships when there are financial obligations involved." Financial obligations. That's how Rebecca viewed my generosity. Not as a gift motivated by love, but as a debt that required her to tolerate my presence and contributions with grudging politeness. I stood in that hallway for several minutes, processing the fact that my daughter-in-law saw me as an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a family member to be cherished. Worse, she was discussing my financial obligations as if they were leverage she could use to control how I was treated at family gatherings. When I rejoined the party, I watched the dynamics with new eyes. Rebecca's friends were indeed elegant, sophisticated women who spoke knowledgeably about art, travel, and cultural events. But they were also women whose lifestyles were funded by family money, inheritance, or husbands' high-income careers. Rebecca fit seamlessly into this group now, adopting their casual assumptions about money and their subtle dismissiveness toward anyone who didn't meet their social standards. Michael, for his part, seemed genuinely happy. He moved through the party with the confidence of someone who'd achieved his vision of success. Beautiful wife, beautiful home, beautiful social circle. The fact that none of it was financially sustainable without my support didn't seem to trouble him. In his mind, he'd earned this lifestyle through his education, his career, and his marriage to someone who understood how to live well. I left the party early, claiming fatigue, but really unable to spend another hour watching my son and his wife treat me like a useful but embarrassing relative, whose contributions were tolerated rather than appreciated. The drive home gave me time to think about how fundamentally our relationship had changed since I'd agreed to finance their house. Before the mortgage, family gatherings had felt genuinely warm. Michael and Rebecca had been grateful for my presence, interested in my opinions, respectful of my experience and wisdom. They'd treated me like someone whose love and support were valued for their own sake. Now I felt like a fixture in their lives, necessary but not particularly welcome, tolerated because of what I provided, rather than cherished for who I was. They'd kept the form of family relationships while draining them of actual affection or respect. Over the following months, this pattern intensified. Rebecca's social calendar expanded to include charity galas, art gallery openings, and wine tastings that required increasingly expensive wardrobes and accessories. Michael joined additional professional organizations and began talking about the importance of maintaining visibility in their social and business networks. Their monthly mortgage payments to me never varied. $4,200 arrived by automatic transfer on the first of every month like clockwork. But I began to understand that in their minds, this payment had transformed from gratitude for financial assistance into a business transaction that entitled them to treat me as a silent partner whose personal feelings were irrelevant. The wake-up call came in October, when Rebecca casually mentioned that they'd decided to spend Christmas in Aspen with her parents and several other families from their social circle. "We've rented this amazing ski house," she'd explained over dinner at my house, a tradition I'd maintained despite increasingly feeling like an obligation they fulfilled rather than time they enjoyed. 8 bedrooms, full catering staff, spa services, the whole experience. It'll be our first real vacation since the wedding. I'd set down my fork carefully. "What about Christmas dinner here? We've had Christmas at my house every year since Michael was born." Rebecca's expression had been patient but firm, the look of someone explaining obvious facts to someone who was being unreasonably dense. "Patricia, we're adults now with our own lives and traditions. We can't spend every holiday accommodating old routines that don't really fit our current lifestyle." "Your current lifestyle," I'd repeated slowly. "Exactly. Michael's career requires maintaining relationships with important clients and colleagues. These are the kinds of people who can really open doors for his future advancement. Christmas in Aspen isn't just a vacation, it's a strategic investment in our professional network." Michael had remained silent during this exchange, but his lack of objection felt like agreement. My son, who'd never missed a Christmas at home, who'd grown up with traditions we'd maintained for 35 years, was willing to abandon all of it for a networking opportunity disguised as a luxury vacation. That night, alone in my house with the Christmas decorations I'd already begun putting up, I finally admitted what I'd been avoiding for months. My generosity had enabled Michael and Rebecca to build a lifestyle they couldn't afford, and in the process, they'd relegated me from beloved family member to convenient financial resource. They were living in my house, socializing with people whose respect depended on wealth they hadn't earned, and making decisions about their future without considering how those decisions affected the person who'd made their current lifestyle possible. Something needed to change, I just wasn't sure yet what that change would look like. The first thing I did after Rebecca announced their Aspen Christmas plans was call my financial advisor. Thomas Chen had been managing my investments for 12 years, ever since Robert's death, had forced me to take a more active role in our financial planning. He was methodical, conservative, and had the kind of analytical mind that could cut through emotional decision-making to expose the hard realities underneath. "Tom," I said when his secretary put me through, "I need you to run a complete analysis of the family mortgage I set up with Michael. I want to understand exactly what my exposure is and what my options are if I need to make changes." There was a pause. Tom had advised against the family mortgage from the beginning, not because he questioned my ability to afford it, but because he had seen too many similar arrangements destroy family relationships while creating complicated financial entanglements. "Are you having second thoughts about the arrangement?" he asked carefully. "I'm having thoughts about a lot of things. How quickly can you pull together a comprehensive report?" "Give me 3 days. Patricia, is everything all right?" I looked around my empty house, at the Christmas decorations I'd been putting up alone for the first time in 35 years, at the dining room table set for one. "I'm not sure yet, but I intend to find out." Tom's report arrived by secure email on a Friday morning. 47 pages of financial analysis that laid out my situation with brutal clarity. The numbers themselves weren't surprising. I'd known the basic terms of Michael and Rebecca's mortgage when I'd agreed to it. What shocked me was seeing the broader financial picture Tom had assembled, using public records, credit reports I was legally entitled to access as their mortgage holder, and financial disclosure documents they'd provided during the loan application process. Tom had constructed a comprehensive picture of Michael and Rebecca's financial behavior since moving to Westfield. The home equity line of credit they'd taken out without consulting me was just the beginning. They'd also opened new credit card accounts, increased the limits on existing cards, and taken out a personal loan to finance Rebecca's car, a BMW SUV that cost more than most people earned in a year. Their total debt load, including the mortgage I held, now exceeded $1.2 million. But more troubling than the debt was their spending pattern. Tom had analyzed their bank records, which I could access as their mortgage servicer, and identified expenditures that painted a picture of people living far beyond any reasonable interpretation of their means. $15,000 in a single month at high-end restaurants and country club events, $8,000 for a weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard, $12,000 on Rebecca's wardrobe for a single charity gala season, monthly expenses that would have been challenging for people earning twice Michael's salary. "The concerning pattern," Tom had written in his analysis, "is that their discretionary spending has increased rather than decreased since taking on the mortgage obligation. Most responsible borrowers would view a family loan as an opportunity to reduce other expenses and build financial stability. Your son and daughter-in-law appear to view it as permission to escalate their lifestyle even further." The report included a projection of their financial trajectory based on current spending patterns. Even with regular salary increases and assuming Rebecca eventually returned to full-time employment, they would never be able to pay off their total debt load. The only scenarios that resulted in financial stability involved either dramatic lifestyle changes they'd shown no inclination to make, or continued family financial support that went well beyond the original mortgage arrangement. But Tom's most damning observation was buried on page 36. Based on the financial behavior patterns documented in this analysis, it appears likely that Michael and Rebecca Brennan view family financial assistance not as temporary support to achieve independence, but as a permanent subsidy that enables lifestyle choices they could not otherwise afford. I read that sentence 3 times before its full implications sank in. My son and his wife weren't using my generosity to build toward financial independence. They were using it as a foundation for permanent dependence, creating a lifestyle that required ongoing family support to maintain. The realization sent me to my computer to do additional research that Tom's professional boundaries had prevented him from, including in his official report. Using social media platforms I'd previously ignored, I dove into Rebecca's Instagram and Facebook accounts to see how she was presenting their lifestyle to the world. What I found was even more disturbing than Tom's financial analysis. Rebecca had cultivated an online presence that portrayed her as a successful lifestyle influencer, someone whose taste and sophistication made her worthy of emulation. Her posts featured their Westfield house as if it were entirely their achievement, with captions like, "Grateful for this beautiful space where we can entertain and build memories, and nothing beats hosting friends in a home that truly reflects your values." There was no mention of family assistance, no acknowledgement that their beautiful space existed because of someone else's financial sacrifice. Instead, Rebecca had created a narrative where she and Michael were self-made success stories. Young professionals who'd achieved the American dream through hard work and smart choices. The comments on these posts were revealing in their own way. Friends congratulated Rebecca on her amazing eye for design and praised Michael for providing so well for his family. Rebecca responded to these compliments with gracious humility, accepting credit for achievements that were only possible because of my investment. But the most painful discovery came when I found a private Facebook group for young wives in Westfield, a forum where Rebecca felt free to be more candid about her real opinions. Through a friend's account, my neighbor Helen, whose daughter-in-law was also a member, I was able to see Rebecca's posts in this supposedly private space. Anyone else dealing with challenging in-laws? Rebecca had written just 2 weeks earlier. Love Michael's mom, but she's very set in her ways and doesn't really understand how life works for our generation. Still doing things like cooking from scratch and acting like spending money on experiences is wasteful. It's sweet, but sometimes exhausting to manage. The responses from other group members were a chorus of sympathy and shared frustration about elderly relatives who, quote, didn't understand modern lifestyle choices. Rebecca had responded to several of these comments with increasingly revealing details about our relationship. The hardest part is feeling grateful while also wanting to live your own life, she'd written. Family support comes with so many strings attached, even when people don't say it directly. There's this constant pressure to include her in everything and pretend like her old-fashioned ideas about money and socializing are still relevant. Reading those words felt like being punched in the stomach. Rebecca wasn't just taking my financial support for granted. She was actively resenting the family obligations that came with it. In her mind, I was a burden to be managed, a relic whose outdated values interfered with her ability to enjoy the lifestyle my money had made possible. But the worst was yet to come. In a post from late September, Rebecca had shared her frustrations about holiday planning, trying to navigate family traditions versus creating our own traditions as adults. Some people think that just because they helped you financially, you owe them your entire social calendar forever. Like, we're grateful, but we also have our own lives and our own friends and our own idea of how we want to spend our holidays. Why is it so hard for older generations to understand that their children eventually need to make their own choices? The responses had been overwhelmingly supportive. Other young wives shared similar stories about parents and in-laws who expected ongoing involvement in their lives in exchange for financial assistance. The consensus was clear. Once you'd received family help, you should be free to live your life without ongoing obligations to include those family members in your choices. Reading these posts, I finally understood how completely Rebecca had reframed our relationship in her mind. My mortgage wasn't generous family support that deserved ongoing gratitude and inclusion. It was a business transaction that had purchased her freedom from family obligations. In Rebecca's worldview, I'd been paid for my contribution through their monthly mortgage payments, and any expectation of continued family closeness was unreasonable overreach. The financial picture was troubling enough, but this emotional revelation was devastating. My daughter-in-law didn't just take my generosity for granted. She actively resented any suggestion that family relationships required ongoing emotional investment. Armed with this new understanding, I began paying closer attention to the subtle dynamics during our interactions. Rebecca's polite distance wasn't shyness or generational differences. It was strategic emotional management. She maintained just enough warmth to avoid conflict, while making it clear that genuine closeness was no longer part of our relationship. Michael's behavior began to make more sense as well. His discomfort during conversations about money, his reluctance to discuss their financial decisions, his increasing tendency to defer to Rebecca's social calendar. All of it reflected someone who'd chosen to prioritize his wife's vision of their life over his family relationships. The turning point came in November, when I decided to test my new understanding of their priorities. Michael called to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner at their house, an invitation extended with the perfunctory politeness of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than sharing a desire for my company. "That sounds lovely," I said. "Should I bring my usual contributions, the sweet potato casserole and pumpkin bread?" There was a pause. "Actually, Mom, Rebecca has hired a caterer this year. She thought it would be easier than trying to coordinate everyone's cooking schedules." A caterer for Thanksgiving, the holiday that had always been about family recipes, shared preparation, and traditions passed down through generations, was being outsourced to professionals because my contributions were apparently more trouble than they were worth. "I see. Will it just be the three of us?" Another pause. "Well, actually, Rebecca invited a few other couples, the Hendersons and the Williamses and the Jeffersons. People we've gotten close to since moving to Westfield. Rebecca thought it would be nice to expand our holiday traditions to include our new community." Our new community. Not family friends, not people I would enjoy meeting, but Rebecca's social circle. People whose acceptance was more important to her than maintaining traditions that had shaped Michael's entire childhood. "It sounds like you'll have a wonderful time," I said carefully. "Perhaps I'll join Helen and her family this year instead." "Mom, you're still invited. Of course you're invited. It's just going to be a different kind of celebration than what we used to do." Different was certainly the right word. A catered dinner with strangers to replace the family gathering where Michael had learned to carve turkey, and Rebecca had, in previous years, genuinely enjoyed hearing stories about his childhood Thanksgivings. "You know what, Michael? I think I'll pass this year, but thank you for the invitation." The relief in his voice was barely concealed. "Are you sure? Rebecca will be disappointed." We both knew that wasn't true, but neither of us was willing to acknowledge it directly. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen and looked at the Thanksgiving planning notes I'd already started making: grocery lists for traditional family recipes, reminders to polish the good china, thoughts about how to arrange the table to accommodate what I'd assumed would be 3 generations sharing a meal together. Instead, I was spending Thanksgiving alone, while my son and his wife entertained people who'd known them for less than 2 years, but whose social approval mattered more than family relationships that had shaped decades of their lives. That evening, I called my lawyer, Janet Rodriguez, who had handled the legal documentation for Michael's mortgage and had remained my attorney for other personal matters since Robert's death. "Janet, I need to understand what options I have regarding the family mortgage I hold, specifically what my rights are as the mortgage holder, and what circumstances might allow me to call the loan early." "Patricia, are you considering foreclosure on your own son?" "I'm considering everything. Right now, I just need to understand what's legally possible." Janet's research revealed that the mortgage documents we'd signed were professionally drafted and legally sound, but they included several standard provisions that could work in my favor if I chose to use them. Most importantly, the mortgage included an acceleration clause that allowed me to demand full payment if Michael and Rebecca violated any terms of the agreement. Those terms included maintaining the property in good condition, not taking on additional liens without written permission from the primary mortgage holder, and providing annual financial statements to verify their ability to continue making payments. They'd already violated the second provision by taking out their home equity line of credit without my consent. If their current debt load threatened their ability to make future mortgage payments, they were potentially in violation of the third provision as well. "The acceleration clause gives you significant leverage," Janet explained. "If you can document violations of the mortgage terms, you have the legal right to demand immediate payment of the full balance. Given their current financial situation, that would almost certainly force them to sell the house. And if they can't sell quickly enough to pay me back, then you could foreclose, just like any other mortgage holder. The family relationship doesn't change your legal rights as a creditor." The conversation left me with a profound sense of power and responsibility. I held my son's financial future in my hands, but using that power would almost certainly destroy our relationship permanently. Over the following weeks, I wrestled with the question of whether I was being vindictive or simply protective of my own interests. Michael and Rebecca had built a lifestyle they couldn't sustain without ongoing family support, then treated the provider of that support as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a family member to be cherished. But calling their mortgage would be financial devastation for them. They'd lose the house, face bankruptcy, and probably be forced to completely rebuild their lives from scratch. Michael would lose the social connections that mattered so much to Rebecca, and Rebecca would lose the lifestyle that seemed to define her sense of self-worth. The decision was made for me 3 days before Christmas, when Michael called with news that would change everything. "Mom, I have something to tell you about Christmas morning. Rebecca and I have been talking, and we've decided we want to establish our own traditions this year. Just the two of us. Maybe start some rituals we can continue when we have children." "I see. And my role in these new traditions?" "Well, we thought maybe we could see you Christmas afternoon instead. After we've had our private celebration. We could exchange gifts then and catch up." Christmas afternoon. After their private celebration. Like a secondary obligation to be fitted in after the important festivities were complete. "What time Christmas afternoon?" "Maybe around 4. That would give us the morning together and still leave time for a nice visit with you." 4 o'clock on Christmas Day. The time slot typically reserved for distant relatives and family friends. Not the woman who'd raised Michael and funded the house where he'd be enjoying his celebration. "That sounds lovely, Michael. I'll see you both at 4. After I hung up, I walked to my study and pulled out the mortgage documents Janet had helped me review. For the first time since signing them, I read through every page with the careful attention of someone looking for legal remedies rather than family obligations. The acceleration clause was there, clear and enforceable. So were the provisions they'd violated and the documentation requirements they'd ignored. I had grounds to call the mortgage immediately if I chose to exercise my rights. But more than that, I had a son who just told me that my presence on Christmas morning would interfere with the traditions he wanted to establish in the house I'd purchased for him. Christmas morning, I decided, was going to be very different from what Michael and Rebecca were expecting. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of crisp, bright weather that makes Connecticut winters feel magical rather than merely cold. I woke early, as I had every Christmas for the past 6 years since Robert's death, and went through my morning routine with unusual care. Coffee from the French press Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. Breakfast at the kitchen table, where we'd shared thousands of meals. A long look out the window at the snow-covered garden where we'd planned to grow old together. But this morning felt different. Instead of the melancholy that usually accompanied Christmas morning without Robert, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. Today would be the day I reclaimed my dignity and established boundaries that should have existed from the beginning. At 10 o'clock, I called Michael's house. Rebecca answered with the breathless excitement of someone deep into Christmas morning festivities. "Patricia, Merry Christmas! We weren't expecting to hear from you until this afternoon." "Merry Christmas, Rebecca. I hope you and Michael are having a wonderful private celebration." "Oh, we are. The tree looks absolutely perfect. And Michael loved the new watch I gave him. It's exactly the kind of morning we've been dreaming about." "That sounds lovely." "I'm calling because I've decided to move up our gift exchange. I'd like to come over now instead of waiting until 4. There was a pause, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background, Rebecca covering the phone to consult with Michael about this unexpected change in plans. "Well, we weren't really prepared for company quite yet. The house is still a bit of a mess from opening presents, and we haven't had time to shower or get properly dressed." "I understand completely. But this won't take long, and what I have to share with you really can't wait until this afternoon." Another pause, longer this time. Okay, I guess that would be fine." "How soon were you thinking?" "I'm already in my car, actually. I should be there in about 15 minutes. I hung up before Rebecca could object and started my BMW, enjoying the look of my perfectly wrapped gifts in the passenger seat. 3 presents, each chosen with extraordinary care for the message it would send. The drive to Westfield took exactly 14 minutes. Their neighborhood looked like something from a holiday movie. Elegant colonials with professional landscaping, driveways filled with luxury vehicles, the kind of Christmas display that required higher decorating services rather than family traditions. Michael and Rebecca's house fit seamlessly into this picture of affluent suburban perfection, its value entirely dependent on the mortgage I held. I parked in their circular driveway, noting the BMW SUV Rebecca had purchased with their home equity line, and the Audi Michael had upgraded to shortly after moving to Westfield. Two cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries, financed by debt secured against the house I owned. Rebecca answered the door wearing an elegant silk robe that probably cost more than my winter coat, her hair perfectly styled, despite claiming she hadn't had time to get properly dressed. Michael appeared behind her in designer pajamas, looking like a man caught between his wife's social anxieties and his mother's unexpected Christmas visit. "Mom," he said with forced cheer, "this is a nice surprise. Come in, come in. Can I get you some coffee? We just made a fresh pot." Their living room looked like a luxury retail display that had exploded. Expensive electronics, designer handbags, jewelry boxes, and clothing items scattered across surfaces that showcased wealth rather than warmth. The Christmas tree, professionally decorated in coordinated silver and gold, served as backdrop for what appeared to be thousands of dollars worth of gifts. "My goodness," I said, taking in the scope of their Christmas morning haul. "You two certainly spoiled each other this year." Rebecca's laugh was slightly nervous. "Well, Christmas only comes once a year, right? We believe in making it special." "Absolutely. Speaking of special, I brought gifts for both of you." I handed Michael a beautifully wrapped package about the size of a book. "This one's for you, dear." Michael accepted the package with the enthusiasm of someone who'd already opened everything he really wanted but was trying to maintain Christmas morning politeness. He tore off the wrapping paper to reveal a leather portfolio containing documents. "It's..." he began, then stopped as he read the letterhead on the top document. "Mom, what is this?" "It's a comprehensive financial analysis prepared by my investment advisor. Everything about your current financial situation, your debt load, your spending patterns, and your projected ability to meet future obligations. I thought you should see exactly where you stand." Rebecca moved closer to Michael, reading over his shoulder with growing alarm. "Patricia, why would you have someone investigate our finances?" "Because I'm the holder of your primary mortgage, which gives me the legal right to verify your ability to continue making payments. And because I discovered some concerning discrepancies between what you told me about your financial situation and what you've actually done since moving into this house." Michael's face had gone pale as he flipped through pages documenting every credit card, every loan, every major purchase they'd made over the past year. "Mom, I can explain." "I'm sure you can. But first, Rebecca, I have something for you as well." I handed her a package identical to Michael's. Rebecca's gift contained printouts from her social media accounts and screenshots from the private Facebook group where she'd discussed her resentment about family obligations. Her face went from confusion to horror as she recognized her own words describing me as a burden to be managed. How did you? She stammered. "The internet is remarkably permanent, isn't it? I particularly enjoyed reading about how exhausting it is to manage family relationships when there are financial obligations involved. Very illuminating perspective on how you view our family dynamic." Michael was still flipping through the financial analysis, his expression growing more stricken with each page. "Mom, some of these numbers might look concerning, but you have to understand that we're building toward long-term financial stability. The investments we're making now, the investments you're making with money you don't have, secured by a house you couldn't afford, while treating the person who made it all possible like an unwelcome obligation?" I interrupted. "Those investments?" Rebecca had recovered enough composure to shift into damage control mode. "Patricia, I think there's been some misunderstanding about those Facebook posts. That was just venting, the kind of thing everyone does when they're feeling stressed. I didn't mean..." "Oh, I think you meant exactly what you said. You resent having to include me in your lives. You find my values outdated and my presence burdensome. You've created a narrative where you're successful young professionals who've earned your lifestyle through hard work, and my contribution is just an inconvenient detail that comes with strings attached." The room fell silent except for the soft jazz playing from their expensive sound system, Background music for a Christmas morning that was rapidly becoming something none of us had expected. "Mom," Michael said quietly, "even if some of our financial decisions have been ambitious, that doesn't change how we feel about you, your family." "Am I?" "Because family doesn't take out secret loans against property they don't own. Family doesn't spend Christmas morning calculating how to minimize time with relatives who've supported them financially. Family doesn't post on social media about how burdensome their family relationships are." I reached into my purse and pulled out the third gift, this one wrapped in simple brown paper with no decoration. "This is for both of you." Michael accepted the package with obvious reluctance, as if he could sense that whatever it contained would be worse than the financial analysis or social media screenshots. He was right. Inside was a formal legal document with Janet Rodriguez's letterhead, along with a cover letter explaining its contents in language designed for non-lawyers to understand clearly. "It's a notice of acceleration," I explained as Michael read the first page with growing alarm. "Based on your violations of the mortgage terms, specifically taking on additional liens without my written consent and failing to provide accurate financial disclosures, I'm exercising my right to demand immediate payment of the full mortgage balance." "What does that mean?" Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "It means you have 30 days to pay me $847,000, plus accrued interest, or I begin foreclosure proceedings on this house." The silence that followed was profound. Outside, I could hear the sounds of other families enjoying Christmas morning. Children playing with new toys, adults calling greetings to neighbors, the normal sounds of suburban holiday celebration. Inside their living room, my son and his wife were processing the fact that their lifestyle had just come to an abrupt end. "Mom," Michael said finally, "you can't be serious. This would ruin us financially. We'd lose everything. You'd lose what you couldn't afford to begin with. The question is whether you've learned anything from this experience, or whether you just repeat the same patterns somewhere else." Rebecca found her voice, though it came out higher and sharper than her usual controlled tone. "This is vindictive, Patricia. We made some mistakes, yes, but destroying our lives over hurt feelings is just cruel." "Hurt feelings?" I looked at Rebecca with genuine curiosity. "You think this is about hurt feelings?" "Well, yes. You're upset that we wanted to spend Christmas morning alone, upset that we don't include you in every social occasion, upset that we're building our own lives instead of revolving everything around your expectations." I laughed, a sound that surprised all of us. "Rebecca, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about consequences. You took my generosity and used it to build a lifestyle you couldn't afford, then treated me like an inconvenience for expecting normal family relationships in return. You've been living in a fantasy funded by someone else's money while convincing yourselves you earned it." Michael set down the legal documents and looked at me with something between desperation and anger. "So what do you want? An apology? More gratitude? What would it take for you to withdraw this acceleration notice? I want you to understand that your choices have consequences. I want you to face the reality of what your lifestyle actually costs and decide whether it's worth destroying family relationships to maintain. I want you to stop taking my support for granted and start making decisions based on what you can actually afford rather than what you think you deserve." "But the house," Rebecca began, "will be sold to pay off the mortgage, just like any other foreclosure. You'll take whatever equity remains after my loan is satisfied, and you'll start over with a more realistic understanding of what you can afford on Michael's actual salary." The implications were sinking in for both of them. Without the house, they'd lose their social standing in Westfield. Without their current lifestyle, Rebecca's carefully curated image would collapse. Without my ongoing financial support, they'd be forced to live within their actual means for the first time since their wedding. "There has to be another way," Michael said. "Some kind of compromise that doesn't destroy everything we've built." "What you've built is unsustainable," I replied. "It exists only because I've been subsidizing it. The question is whether you want to learn to build something real on your own, or whether you want to keep pretending that borrowed money equals earned success." Rebecca was crying now, not the delicate tears she'd used during previous emotional manipulations, but the harsh sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. "We have nowhere to go. Our friends, our life, everything we've worked for is here." "Then you'll have to work for it legitimately this time. Find housing you can actually afford. Make friends who value you for who you are rather than where you live." Build a life based on what you can sustain instead of what you can borrow. Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the backyard I'd helped them secure. Mom, please, there has to be some way to work this out. We can make changes. Cut expenses. Be more responsible about finances. You've had 4 years to make those changes, Michael. Instead, your spending has increased every year, while your appreciation for the support making it possible has decreased. Why should I believe this time would be different? Because we understand now. We see how our behavior has affected you, and we want to do better. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of genuine understanding versus desperate bargaining. Do you? Do you really understand? Because 20 minutes ago, you were happily enjoying a Christmas morning that excluded me, in a house I paid for, surrounded by gifts purchased with money you borrowed against equity I created. The truth of that statement settled over the room like dust after an explosion. They had been happily excluding me from their Christmas celebration while living in luxury my financial support had made possible. The contradiction was so stark that even they couldn't rationalize it away. What would it take? Rebecca asked quietly. What would we have to do for you to reconsider the acceleration? I looked around their living room, at the evidence of wealth they hadn't earned and couldn't sustain, at 2 adults who'd mistaken my generosity for weakness and my love for obligation. Honestly, I'm not sure anything would be enough at this point. You've shown me who you really are when you think your financial security is guaranteed. You've demonstrated that my support enables you to treat me poorly, rather than motivating you to treat me well. Why would I want to continue a relationship dynamic that brings out the worst in all of us? The finality in my voice seemed to penetrate even their shock and desperation. For the first time since I'd arrived, they appeared to understand that this wasn't a negotiation or a punishment designed to extract better behavior. It was an ending. The acceleration notice is legally binding, I continued. You have 30 days to secure alternative financing if you want to keep the house. If you can't, I'll begin foreclosure proceedings on January 25th. Either way, my role as your private mortgage company ends now. I stood up, collecting my purse and coat with the calm efficiency of someone who'd said everything they came to say. I hope you can salvage something from this experience that helps you build a better life going forward. But it will be a life you finance yourselves, with choices you can actually afford to make. Mom, wait, Michael called as I headed toward the door. This isn't how I wanted things to end between us. I turned back to look at him one final time. This man I'd raised and loved and supported who'd somehow become a stranger, willing to treat his mother as an inconvenience to be managed. Michael, this isn't an ending, it's a beginning. For the first time in 4 years, you'll get to discover who you really are when you're not living off someone else's money. I suspect that person might be someone I'd be proud to know again. I left them there in their beautiful living room, surrounded by expensive gifts and facing the collapse of everything they'd built on borrowed money and borrowed time. As I drove home through the quiet Christmas morning streets of Westfield, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. My phone started ringing before I'd even reached my own driveway. I turned it off and went inside to enjoy the rest of Christmas morning, in my own house, surrounded by my own things, finally free from the obligation to subsidize other people's poor choices and ungrateful behavior. The consequences of their decisions were no longer my responsibility to manage. And that, I realized, was the best Christmas gift I could have given myself. The silence in my house on Christmas afternoon was unlike any I'd experienced since Robert's death. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't waiting for Michael and Rebecca to arrive for dinner. I wasn't setting the table with my grandmother's china or warming the rolls that had been a family tradition since Michael was 5 years old. Instead, I was sitting in my living room reading a mystery novel and drinking tea from my favorite cup. Simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after months of feeling like an unwelcome obligation in my own son's life. My phone, which I'd turned back on around 3 o'clock, showed 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. I scrolled through them, with the detached curiosity of someone watching a drama unfold from a safe distance. Michael's messages started desperate and became increasingly frantic as the afternoon progressed. Mom, please call me back. We need to talk about this. This is insane. You can't just destroy our lives over a misunderstanding. Rebecca is having a panic attack. Please just come back so we can work this out. I'm driving to your house. We need to fix this tonight. Rebecca's messages followed a different trajectory, beginning with damage control and evolving into something closer to rage. Patricia, I think we can all agree that Christmas morning got a little heated. Why don't we start fresh tomorrow? I've deleted those Facebook posts. They were just stress venting and didn't reflect how I really feel. I can't believe you would ruin Christmas over social media posts that were taken out of context. You're destroying our marriage and our future because your feelings got hurt. This is vindictive and cruel. But it was the messages from Rebecca's friends that provided the most insight into how quickly news had spread through their social circle. Helen Morrison, who'd attended their Thanksgiving dinner, had texted, "Becca, I heard what happened. I'm so sorry you're dealing with family drama during the holidays. Some people just can't handle when their children become successful." The irony was breathtaking. Rebecca had spun my decision to call their mortgage as jealousy over their success that existed only because of my financial support. She was portraying herself as the victim of an unreasonable mother-in-law rather than someone facing consequences for taking advantage of family generosity. As promised, Michael arrived at my house around 6 o'clock. I watched through my front window as he sat in his Audi for several minutes before getting out, probably steeling himself for a conversation he'd never imagined having to have. When I opened the door, he looked like he'd aged 5 years since Christmas morning. "Mom, we need to talk." "Of course, come in." I led him to the living room where he'd spent countless childhood hours reading, playing games, and sharing the kind of easy family time that had somehow evolved into obligatory visits managed around Rebecca's social calendar. "I've been thinking about everything you said this morning," he began, "and I want you to know that I understand why you're upset. Rebecca and I have made some mistakes, and we haven't always been as grateful as we should have been for everything you've done for us." I waited for him to continue, curious about whether his understanding went deeper than the surface-level acknowledgement he was offering. "But Mom, calling the mortgage is going to destroy us financially. We'll lose the house, our credit will be ruined, and we'll have to start over from nothing. That seems like a pretty extreme punishment for what amounts to poor communication and some financial missteps. Michael, do you remember what you wanted to be when you grew up?" The question clearly wasn't what he'd expected. What does that have to? Just answer the question. What did you want to be when you were 8 years old? He looked confused but played along. "A teacher. Like you. I wanted to help kids learn and make a difference in their lives." "And when you were 12? "An architect. I was fascinated by how buildings were designed and constructed." "And in high school?" "A journalist. I thought it would be exciting to travel and tell important stories." I nodded. All noble professions. All careers focused on contribution rather than accumulation. When did that change? When did your dreams shift from making a difference to making money? Michael's jaw tightened. "That's not fair. I work in consulting because it pays well enough to support a family. There's nothing wrong with wanting financial security." "There's nothing wrong with financial security, Michael. But there's a big difference between security and the lifestyle you and Rebecca have been pursuing. Teachers, architects, and journalists can all achieve financial security. None of them can afford $800,000 houses in Westfield without family assistance. So you're punishing me for being ambitious? For wanting more than just getting by? I'm not punishing you for ambition. I'm refusing to continue subsidizing a lifestyle that's turned you into someone I don't recognize." The Michael the first raised understood that money was a tool, not a goal. He valued relationships over appearances and character over status symbols. Michael stood up and began pacing, a habit he'd had since childhood when he was working through difficult emotions. "Maybe I have changed. Maybe living in the real world for the past 10 years has taught me things that growing up in your protected environment didn't prepare me for. Such as the fact that money matters more than you want to believe. That the right address and the right connections can make the difference between career success and career stagnation. That Rebecca's family moves in circles where these things matter, and if I want to be part of her world, I need to understand those realities." The honesty of his response was more devastating than his earlier desperation. Michael wasn't defending poor financial decisions made under pressure. He was defending a value system that prioritized appearance over authenticity, connections over competence. And is that who you want to be? Someone whose worth is measured by his address and his car? It's who I need to be to succeed in the world Rebecca and I want to be part of. The world Rebecca wants to be part of, I corrected. Because that world requires my money to access, and my money comes with the expectation that I'll be treated with respect and included in the family life it makes possible. Michael stopped pacing and looked at me directly for the first time since he'd arrived. What do you want, Mom? Specifically. What would it take for you to withdraw the acceleration notice? It was the question I'd been expecting, and I'd spent the afternoon thinking about my answer. I want you to prove that you can build a life within your actual means. I want you to demonstrate that you value family relationships more than social status. I want you to show me that my support enhanced your character rather than corrupting it. How do I prove all that? By living without my financial support for long enough to rediscover who you are when you're not pretending to be wealthier than you really are. By making choices based on what you can afford rather than what you think you deserve. By treating the people who love you better than you treat the people you want to impress. Michael was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the garden where he'd played as a child. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. Rebecca will never agree to downsize our lifestyle voluntarily. Her entire identity is wrapped up in being part of Westfield society. If we lose the house, she'll blame me for not finding a way to fix this. Then maybe you and Rebecca want different things from life. She's my wife, Mom. I love her. I know you do. But love isn't enough to sustain a marriage when you fundamentally disagree about values and priorities. And enabling someone else's poor choices isn't love, it's codependency. The parallel wasn't lost on either of us. Just as I'd been enabling Michael and Rebecca's unsustainable lifestyle, Michael had been enabling Rebecca's unrealistic expectations about money and social status. So what happens now? He asked. Now you figure out what kind of life you can build together based on what you can actually afford. Maybe that means staying in Westfield and downsizing to a house that fits your budget. Maybe it means moving somewhere less expensive where your money goes further. Maybe it means Rebecca getting a full-time job so you can genuinely afford the lifestyle she wants. And if we can't make it work, then you'll learn something important about what your marriage was really based on. If Rebecca can only love you when you're providing a lifestyle you can't afford, then she was never really in love with you anyway. Michael flinched at the harsh truth of that statement, but he didn't argue with it. Perhaps on some level, he'd already begun to suspect that Rebecca's love was contingent on his ability to provide access to a world she couldn't enter on her own. After Michael left, I called my neighbor Helen to check on her Christmas and found myself sharing more about the day's events than I'd planned. Good for you, Helen said after I'd explained my decision to call the mortgage. I've been watching those two for the past year, and I've been wondering when you were going to stop letting them take advantage of your generosity. You think I did the right thing? Patricia, you've spent 4 years funding a lifestyle for people who treat you like an ATM with inconvenient emotional needs. The only question is why it took you this long to stand up for yourself. Helen's support was reassuring, but I knew that not everyone would see my decision so favorably. Family financial disputes have a way of forcing people to choose sides, and I suspected that Rebecca's charm and victim narrative would win her significant sympathy from their social circle. That prediction proved accurate over the following days. The messages and phone calls continued, but their tone shifted as Rebecca's version of events spread through their network of friends and family. Rebecca's mother, Linda Walsh, called on December 27th with barely concealed hostility. Patricia, I hope you're satisfied with the chaos you've created. Rebecca is devastated. Michael is drinking too much, and their marriage is falling apart because you couldn't handle the fact that they wanted to establish their own Christmas traditions. Linda, did Rebecca mention that those Christmas traditions excluded me from the house I paid for? She mentioned that you felt left out of their private celebration, yes. But that hardly justifies destroying their financial security over hurt feelings. The phrase hurt feelings was becoming a theme in how my decision was being characterized. It was easier for people to dismiss my actions as emotional overreaction than to acknowledge the systematic disrespect and financial irresponsibility that had led to this point. Did she also mention the unauthorized loans they took against the property? Or their spending patterns that have put them over $1 million in debt? Or the social media posts, where she described me as a burden to be managed? There was a pause. I'm sure there are two sides to every story, Patricia. But right now, I'm more concerned about my daughter's well-being than I am about parsing the details of who said what. Linda's call was followed by similar conversations with other members of Rebecca's family and their social circle. Each caller had received a carefully curated version of events that portrayed me as a vindictive mother-in-law who'd used financial leverage to punish family members for minor social slights. The most painful call came from Michael's former college roommate, David, who'd remained close to our family over the years. "Mrs. Brennan, I have to admit I'm surprised by what I'm hearing. This doesn't sound like something you would do. Michael says you're foreclosing on their house because Rebecca didn't invite you to Christmas morning." David: "Did Michael explain why Rebecca didn't invite me to Christmas morning in the house I purchased for them?" "He said you'd been having some family tension lately, and they thought it would be better to have some space." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with David gradually understanding the broader context that Michael had omitted from his version of events. By the end, David's tone had shifted from disappointment to something closer to admiration. "You know what, Mrs. Brennan? I think you're right to draw the line somewhere. I've been watching Michael change over the past few years, and not necessarily for the better. Maybe this wake-up call is exactly what he needs." But David's eventual support didn't diminish the isolation I felt as the week progressed. Most of the people calling to intervene on Michael and Rebecca's behalf didn't want to hear the full story. They wanted me to back down from a decision they viewed as disproportionately harsh, regardless of what had motivated it. The pressure reached its peak on New Year's Eve, when Michael called to inform me that he and Rebecca had consulted with a lawyer about challenging the acceleration notice. "Our attorney thinks we might have grounds to dispute the acceleration based on the family nature of the loan," he said. "He's suggesting we argue that normal commercial lending standards shouldn't apply to informal family arrangements." "Michael, nothing about our arrangement was informal. We used licensed attorneys, filed proper documentation, and followed every legal requirement for mortgage transactions. The fact that we're related doesn't invalidate the contract terms you agreed to. But surely a judge would consider the circumstances. The fact that this is a family dispute over relatively minor issues, not a case of genuine financial hardship or fraud." I felt a familiar surge of frustration at Michael's continued inability to grasp the seriousness of what he and Rebecca had done. "Minor issues? You violated the mortgage terms, lied about your financial situation, and systematically excluded me from the family life I was supporting financially. In what universe are those minor issues? Compared to the devastation you're causing us, yes, they're minor. We're talking about losing our home, our credit rating, our entire future, because you're upset about social media posts and Christmas morning plans." The conversation ended badly, with Michael hanging up after informing me that their lawyer would be filing papers to delay the foreclosure process. I spent the last day of the year consulting with Janet Rodriguez about how to respond to potential legal challenges, while processing the reality that my relationship with my son had deteriorated to the point where he was threatening to sue me. But as I sat alone on New Year's Eve, watching neighbors' fireworks through my living room window, I realized something unexpected. I felt more at peace than I had in months. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't subsidizing people who resented my existence. I wasn't tolerating disrespect in exchange for the illusion of family closeness. I wasn't pretending that my generosity was appreciated when it was clearly taken for granted. The house was quiet, but it was my quiet. The decisions about how to spend my money were mine alone. The upcoming year would unfold according to my choices, rather than other people's expectations. Whatever legal challenges Michael and Rebecca might mount, whatever social consequences I might face from their friends and family, I had reclaimed something that had been slowly eroding for years, my self-respect. And that, I decided, was worth whatever price I might have to pay for it. January arrived with a blizzard that dumped 18 inches of snow across Connecticut, forcing the entire state into a temporary hibernation that felt appropriate for the Cold War that had developed between me and Michael's family. The legal papers arrived by certified mail on January 8th, delivered by a postal worker who had to trudge through drifts to reach my front door. The document was impressively thick, 37 pages of legal arguments, exhibits, and character references designed to paint me as an unreasonable matriarch, wielding financial power to control and punish family members who dared to establish independence. Rebecca and Michael's attorney, Harrison Webb from the prestigious Hartford firm of Webb, Morrison and Associates, had crafted a narrative that was both legally sophisticated and emotionally manipulative. Their central argument rested on the claim that family mortgages should be held to different standards than commercial lending arrangements. Webb argued that normal business relationships didn't involve the complex emotional dynamics of family loyalty, gratitude, and generational obligation that made my acceleration notice inappropriate and potentially unconscionable. The defendant Patricia Brennan has weaponized a family financial arrangement to punish the plaintiffs for exercising normal adult autonomy in their personal and social decisions, the filing read. Mrs. Brennan's actions constitute an abuse of financial power designed to coerce compliance with her personal preferences regarding holiday celebrations, social relationships, and lifestyle choices that fall well within the plaintiff's rights as independent adults. I had to admit that Webb was skilled at his craft. Reading his version of events, I almost sounded like a controlling monster who'd used my wealth to manipulate vulnerable young people into compliance with my outdated expectations. The filing painted Michael and Rebecca as victims of financial elder abuse, an ironic reversal that would have been amusing if it weren't so potentially damaging to my legal position. But Webb's most clever strategy was his use of character witnesses. The filing included affidavits from a dozen people attesting to Michael and Rebecca's character, their devotion to family, and their responsible approach to financial obligations. Rebecca's country club friends described her as generous and community-minded, while Michael's colleagues praised his integrity and professional dedication. Most painful was the affidavit from Michael's former Little League coach, who remembered him as a respectful young man who clearly adored his mother and would never intentionally cause her distress. The implication was that any distress I felt must be the result of misunderstanding rather than legitimate grievance. I called Janet Rodriguez immediately after reading through the entire filing. "They're good," Janet admitted when I finished reading key sections aloud. "Webb has a reputation for exactly this kind of case. Family financial disputes where he can muddy the waters by focusing on emotional dynamics rather than contractual obligations. Can they actually win? They can certainly cause you a lot of trouble and expense. Family court judges tend to be sympathetic to arguments about preserving family relationships, especially when one party has significantly more financial resources than the other. If Webb can convince a judge that you're using money as a weapon rather than enforcing legitimate contractual rights, you could face serious complications." Janet's assessment was sobering, but not entirely unexpected. I'd known that challenging Michael and Rebecca would involve more than simply exercising my legal rights as a mortgage holder. Their social connections, their ability to present themselves as sympathetic victims, and the natural reluctance of courts to interfere in family relationships all worked in their favor. What's our best strategy? Documentation. We need to prove that this isn't about hurt feelings or control issues, but about clear violations of contractual terms and systematic financial irresponsibility that justified your decision to protect your investment. Over the following week, Janet and I assembled a comprehensive response that laid out the timeline of Michael and Rebecca's financial deception with surgical precision. We documented every unauthorized loan, every misleading statement about their financial capacity, every violation of the mortgage terms they'd agreed to when accepting my support. But our most powerful evidence came from their own behavior. Janet had subpoenaed their credit card records, bank statements, and social media accounts, creating a picture of people who'd used family financial support not to build toward independence, but to fund increasingly extravagant lifestyle choices, while publicly dismissing the source of their financial security. "Your Honor," Janet wrote in our response filing, "this case represents a classic example of borrowers who view family financial assistance as an entitlement rather than a privilege. The plaintiffs have systematically violated their mortgage terms while treating the mortgage holder with increasing disrespect and dishonesty. Mrs. Brennan's decision to exercise her legal rights under the acceleration clause represents responsible financial management, not family manipulation." The first court hearing was scheduled for January 22, just 3 days before my original foreclosure deadline. I spent the preceding week alternating between confidence in my legal position and anxiety about the public nature of what had become a very private family dispute. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in the Navy suit I'd worn to parent-teacher conferences when I needed to project authority with difficult parents. Janet met me at the courthouse steps, carrying boxes of documentation that represented 4 years of financial records and family communication. "Remember," she said as we climbed the courthouse steps, "this isn't about whether you were right to feel hurt or disappointed. This is about whether you had legal grounds to call the mortgage based on documented violations of the agreement." Hartford Superior Court was busier than I'd expected, filled with lawyers, families, and individuals dealing with various civil disputes. Michael and Rebecca sat across the courtroom with Harrison Webb, who looked exactly like Central Casting's idea of an expensive attorney: silver hair, custom suit, and the kind of confident bearing that comes from decades of winning cases through superior preparation and presentation. Rebecca had clearly dressed for maximum sympathy impact. Gone were the designer clothes and expensive accessories I'd become accustomed to seeing her wear. Instead, she wore a simple black dress and minimal jewelry, looking like a young mother struggling against overwhelming financial pressure, rather than someone who'd spent the previous year posting Instagram photos of luxury vacations and designer purchases. Michael looked genuinely distressed, which I suspected was authentic rather than performance art. Whatever his faults, he'd never been particularly skilled at deception, and the stress of facing potential financial ruin was clearly taking its toll. Judge Patricia Wong was a woman in her 50s with the kind of efficient demeanor that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of family financial drama during her 20 years on the bench. She reviewed both filings carefully before calling the hearing to order. "This case involves a family mortgage arrangement that has deteriorated into a dispute over acceleration and foreclosure," she began. "Mr. Webb, you're seeking a temporary restraining order to prevent Mrs. Brennan from proceeding with foreclosure. Please present your arguments." Webb's presentation was masterful theater. He painted Michael and Rebecca as young professionals who'd accepted family assistance in good faith, then found themselves trapped in an arrangement that came with ever-escalating emotional demands, that culminated in financial retaliation when they attempted to establish normal adult boundaries. "Your Honor, the defendants want this court to believe that Christmas morning plans and social media posts constitute grounds for destroying a young couple's financial future," Webb argued. "Mrs. Brennan has used her economic leverage to punish behavior that falls well within her son and daughter-in-law's rights as independent adults." Webb called Michael to testify first, and my son presented himself as a devoted family member who'd been blindsided by his mother's extreme reaction to minor family tensions. "I love my mother," Michael said, his voice breaking slightly. "I never meant to hurt her or make her feel unappreciated. If we made mistakes in how we communicated our gratitude, we want the chance to make those mistakes right. But losing our home seems like an incredibly harsh punishment for what amounts to poor communication." Rebecca's testimony was even more effective. She acknowledged making some regrettable social media posts during a stressful period, but framed them as normal venting that had been taken out of context and blown out of proportion. "Mrs. Brennan has been incredibly generous to us," Rebecca said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I would never want her to think that generosity wasn't appreciated. But Patricia has very specific expectations about how grateful behavior should look, and when we tried to establish some independence in our holiday plans, she interpreted that as rejection rather than normal adult development." The performance was compelling enough that I began to worry about how my own testimony would sound in comparison. Webb had successfully reframed the entire dispute as a story about an overbearing mother-in-law using financial leverage to control adult children who'd attempted to establish reasonable boundaries. When Janet called me to testify, I felt the weight of dozens of eyes evaluating my credibility, my motivations, and my character. The woman sitting in the witness chair was someone I'd never expected to become, a mother who'd been forced to use legal action to protect herself from her own son's financial irresponsibility. "Mrs. Brennan," Janet began, "please explain to the court the specific mortgage violations that led to your decision to accelerate the loan." I took a deep breath and began with the facts. The unauthorized home equity line of credit that increased my risk without my consent. The misleading financial disclosures that had hidden their true debt load. The spending patterns that indicated they viewed my mortgage as permission to escalate their lifestyle rather than motivation to build toward independence. Your Honor, this case isn't about Christmas morning or social media posts, I said, looking directly at Judge Wong. It's about a 4-year pattern of financial irresponsibility and decreasing respect for the person making their lifestyle possible. I didn't call this mortgage to punish hurt feelings. I called it to protect my financial interests from borrowers who demonstrated they couldn't be trusted to honor their obligations. Janet introduced evidence systematically, bank records showing escalating luxury spending, credit reports revealing multiple undisclosed loans, documentation of property modifications made without my permission as the mortgage holder. The picture that emerged was of people who'd treated my generosity as a license for financial recklessness, rather than an opportunity to build stability. But Webb was prepared for our financial arguments. During cross-examination, he focused relentlessly on the personal aspects of our family conflict. Mrs. Brennan, isn't it true that you were upset when Michael and Rebecca decided to spend Christmas morning alone? I was disappointed, yes. And isn't it true that you hired investigators to research their private social media accounts? I hired a financial advisor to analyze their spending patterns and verify their ability to continue making mortgage payments. The social media research was part of understanding their actual financial situation versus what they'd told me. But you admit that you read private Facebook posts where Rebecca expressed frustration about family obligations. I read posts where she described me as a burden to be managed and discussed her resentment about including me in holiday plans. Yes. Webb continued this line of questioning for over an hour, trying to establish that my financial decision had been motivated by emotional hurt rather than legitimate business concerns. By the time he finished, I felt like I'd been portrayed as a petty, vindictive woman who'd used money to punish family members for normal boundary setting. Judge Wong recessed for lunch, giving both sides time to regroup for closing arguments. Janet and I ate sandwiches in a conference room down the hall from the courtroom while she prepared me for what might happen next. Webb is very good at making sympathetic victims out of people who've made bad choices, she said. But the financial evidence is overwhelming. Even if the judge is sympathetic to their emotional arguments, she can't ignore the clear violations of contractual terms. What's the worst-case scenario? She grants their restraining order and forces you into extended negotiations about modifying the mortgage terms. Best case, she denies their motion and allows the acceleration to proceed as planned. When court reconvened, Webb's closing argument was an emotional appeal to the court's sympathy for young people whose lives would be destroyed by what he characterized as a family dispute that had gotten out of hand. Your Honor, families disagree. Generational conflicts over money and independence are as old as humanity itself. But we don't usually resolve these conflicts by destroying people's lives through legal technicalities. Mrs. Brennan has the legal right to call this mortgage, but exercising that right under these circumstances is unconscionable. Janet's closing was more straightforward. Your Honor, this court is being asked to ignore clear contractual violations because the violators are family members of the creditor. The law doesn't provide different standards for family financial agreements. Mrs. Brennan has documented grounds for acceleration, and the court should allow her to proceed with protecting her legitimate financial interests. Judge Wong took 30 minutes to review the evidence before delivering her ruling. When she returned to the bench, her expression was unreadable. This case represents a family financial arrangement that has deteriorated into mutual accusations of bad faith, she began. However, after reviewing all evidence presented, the court finds that Mrs. Brennan has documented clear violations of the mortgage terms that justify her decision to accelerate the loan. I felt a surge of relief, but Judge Wong wasn't finished. However, the court is also concerned about the potential for irreparable harm to the plaintiffs if foreclosure proceeds immediately. Therefore, the court will grant a limited restraining order requiring the parties to attempt mediation before any foreclosure action may commence, a partial victory that felt more like a setback. We'd won on the legal merits, but Michael and Rebecca had bought themselves additional time to either find alternative financing or convince a mediator that some compromise was possible. As we left the courthouse, Janet tried to frame the result positively. She validated your legal position completely. The mediation requirement is just a formality. You'll be able to proceed with foreclosure if they can't come up with the money. But I knew that mediation would provide Webb with another opportunity to pressure me into accepting some modified arrangement that would leave Michael and Rebecca in the house while I continued subsidizing their lifestyle. The legal battle was far from over, and the emotional cost was just beginning to become clear. The court-mandated mediation took place in a sterile conference room at the Hartford County Family Services Building on a gray February morning that matched the mood of everyone involved. Dr. Eleanor Fitzgerald, our appointed mediator, was a family therapist with 30 years of experience helping wealthy families navigate disputes that mixed emotional and financial complications. "I've reviewed both sides' positions," Dr. Fitzgerald began, "and it's clear that this conflict goes much deeper than the specific mortgage terms. We're dealing with fundamental disagreements about family obligations, financial responsibility, and respect. My goal today isn't to determine who's right or wrong, but to see if we can find a path forward that preserves both family relationships and everyone's legitimate interests." Michael and Rebecca sat across from me at the polished conference table, with Harrison Webb beside them looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Webb's confident courtroom demeanor had been replaced by barely concealed irritation at being forced into what he clearly viewed as amateur-hour family therapy. "Before we discuss potential solutions," Dr. Fitzgerald continued, "I'd like each party to explain in their own words what they believe this conflict is really about. Mrs. Brennan, would you like to start?" I looked across the table at Michael and Rebecca, these two people I'd once loved unconditionally, and tried to find words that captured 4 years of gradual disillusionment. "This isn't about money," I began. "It's about what my generosity enabled them to become. When I agreed to finance their house, I thought I was helping them build a foundation for their future. Instead, I created a safety net that allowed them to make increasingly poor decisions while treating me with decreasing respect. They transformed from grateful family members into entitled consumers of my financial support." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair but remained silent while Dr. Fitzgerald turned to Michael. "Michael, how do you see this situation?" My son looked older than his 35 years, worn down by months of stress, and the realization that his lifestyle was unsustainable without continued family subsidy. "I think we lost sight of the fact that Mom's support came with emotional expectations we weren't meeting. We got caught up in building the life we wanted and stopped appreciating the person who made it possible. But I also think Mom's reaction has been disproportionate to our mistakes." "Rebecca?" Rebecca had clearly prepared for this moment. "I believe we've all made mistakes in how we've communicated and treated each other. I regret the social media posts that hurt Patricia's feelings, and I understand that we should have been more inclusive in our holiday planning. But I also think that family financial support shouldn't come with the expectation that adult children surrender their autonomy in social and lifestyle decisions." Dr. Fitzgerald nodded thoughtfully. "Those are 3 very different perspectives on the same set of events. Let's explore some potential solutions. Mrs. Brennan, what would it take for you to consider modifying the acceleration notice?" I'd been dreading this question because I suspected my honest answer would end any possibility of reconciliation. I would need to see evidence that they've learned something from this experience, that they understand the difference between financial assistance and financial enabling, that they're capable of living within their actual means rather than constantly escalating their lifestyle expectations. And specifically, what would that evidence look like? They would need to demonstrate that they can maintain a reasonable standard of living on Michael's actual salary without additional family support. They would need to pay down their accumulated debt to manageable levels. They would need to treat me with the respect due to someone who's made their lifestyle possible, rather than as a burden to be managed. Webb leaned forward with the expression of someone who'd identified a weakness to exploit. "Mrs. Brennan, are you saying that your son and daughter-in-law's reconciliation with you depends on their accepting a lower standard of living? That seems to contradict your earlier claims that this isn't about control. I'm saying that their reconciliation with reality needs to happen before any reconciliation with me is possible. They've been living a lifestyle they can't afford, funded by money they didn't earn, while treating the person providing that money with contempt. That's not sustainable financially or emotionally." Dr. Fitzgerald turned back to Michael and Rebecca. "How do you respond to Mrs. Brennan's conditions?" Michael and Rebecca exchanged glances before Michael spoke carefully. We're willing to make some adjustments to our spending and be more conscious about including mom and family activities. But we can't accept the level of lifestyle reduction she seems to be demanding. We have professional obligations, social commitments, and personal standards that require maintaining a certain level of financial stability. What he means, I said quietly, is that they're willing to make cosmetic changes as long as I continue subsidizing the lifestyle they've become accustomed to. That's exactly the attitude that created this problem in the first place. The mediation continued for 4 hours, with Dr. Fitzgerald patiently exploring various compromise scenarios that might allow Michael and Rebecca to keep the house while addressing my concerns about their financial responsibility. Each potential solution foundered on the same fundamental disagreement. They wanted me to continue enabling their unsustainable lifestyle in exchange for superficial behavioral modifications, while I wanted them to demonstrate genuine financial responsibility before I would consider any ongoing support. Let me propose a specific compromise, Dr. Fitzgerald said as the afternoon wore on. What if Michael and Rebecca agreed to take on the full mortgage payments at market interest rates, providing Mrs. Brennan with a commercial return on her investment while eliminating the family loan dynamic that's created so much tension? Webb perked up at this suggestion, clearly seeing it as a potential victory for his clients. That could work. Mrs. Brennan gets her money back with interest, and my clients keep their home. But I'd already done the mathematics of this scenario during Thomas Chen's financial analysis. At current market rates, their monthly payments would increase to over $6,800. Given their existing debt load and spending patterns, that's completely unrealistic, unless they make dramatic lifestyle changes they've already said they're unwilling to consider. Perhaps they could refinance their other debts or find ways to increase their income, Dr. Fitzgerald suggested. Rebecca laughed bitterly. Patricia, you're basically saying that no solution is acceptable unless we agree to live like graduate students again. We've built a life in Westfield. We have friends, professional relationships, social obligations. We can't just abandon everything we've worked for because you've decided our lifestyle is somehow morally objectionable. You haven't worked for it, Rebecca. I paid for it. That's the point you keep missing. The room fell silent as the fundamental truth of our conflict finally surfaced clearly. Rebecca and Michael had built their entire adult identity around a lifestyle they couldn't afford, and they were asking me to continue funding that identity indefinitely in exchange for token gestures of appreciation. Dr. Fitzgerald made one final attempt at compromise. What if we structured a gradual transition? Mrs. Brennan could extend the acceleration deadline by 6 months, giving Michael and Rebecca time to either secure alternative financing or develop a realistic plan for lifestyle adjustment. I looked across the table at my son and his wife, these two people whose financial irresponsibility had forced me to become someone I'd never wanted to be, a creditor pursuing collection against her own family. Dr. Fitzgerald, I appreciate your efforts to find middle ground. But the past 4 hours have confirmed what I suspected. Michael and Rebecca aren't interested in genuine change. They want me to continue subsidizing their choices, while making minimal adjustments to their behavior. That's not a compromise. It's a continuation of the dynamic that created this problem. I stood up and gathered my purse, feeling the weight of a decision that would probably end my relationship with my son permanently. The acceleration notice stands. They have until March 15th to secure alternative financing or the foreclosure will proceed. Webb started to object, but I was already walking toward the door. Michael, I hope someday you'll understand that loving someone sometimes means refusing to enable their poor choices. Rebecca, I hope you find happiness in whatever life you can actually afford to build. The drive home from Hartford gave me time to process what had just happened. I'd officially ended my financial relationship with my son and his wife, probably destroying any chance of future reconciliation in the process. The mediation had confirmed that no middle ground existed between their sense of entitlement and my demand for accountability. Over the following weeks, I watched from a distance as Michael and Rebecca scrambled to save their lifestyle. Through my neighbor Helen, who remained connected to their social circle, I learned about their increasingly desperate attempts to secure alternative financing. They'd approached Rebecca's parents for a loan to buy me out, but the Walsh family's restaurant business was struggling with debt problems of its own. They'd applied for commercial mortgages but been rejected due to their debt-to-income ratio. They'd even explored the possibility of finding investors willing to buy into their house as a rental property. But the numbers didn't work for anyone involved. "Rebecca's telling people that you're forcing them into bankruptcy out of spite," Helen reported during one of our coffee sessions. "But privately, I think some of their friends are starting to see the situation more clearly. When someone owns a house worth nearly $1 million but can't find anyone willing to lend them money to buy it, people start asking questions about what's really going on." The most telling development came in mid-March, just days before the foreclosure deadline. Michael called to request one final conversation, not to negotiate, but to say goodbye. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Hartford, neutral territory where we could have the kind of honest conversation that had become impossible at either of our homes. Michael looked exhausted, defeated in a way that reminded me of his father during the final stages of his illness. "We're going to lose the house," he said without preamble. "No bank will lend us enough to pay you off, and we can't afford the monthly payments even if they would. Rebecca's parents offered to help, but they don't have that kind of liquid cash available." "I'm sorry it came to this, Michael." "Are you? Really? Because it seems like this is exactly what you wanted to happen." I considered his question carefully. "I wanted you to understand that actions have consequences. I wanted you to recognize that my generosity deserved respect rather than resentment. I wanted you to build a life based on what you could actually achieve, rather than what I could provide. If that required losing the house to learn those lessons, then, yes, I suppose this is what I wanted." Michael stared into his coffee cup for a long time before speaking again. "Rebecca blames you entirely. She says you destroyed our marriage and our future, because we didn't treat you like the matriarch you think you deserve to be. What do you think?" "I think we both made mistakes. But I also think your reaction was more destructive than anything we did wrong." I felt a familiar sadness at Michael's continued inability to accept responsibility for his choices. Even facing the loss of everything he'd built with my money, he still saw himself as more victim than perpetrator. "Michael, do you remember teaching you to ride a bike when you were 7? The question clearly wasn't what he'd expected. "What does that have to do with anything? You fell dozens of times, scraped your knees, cried, wanted to give up. But you kept getting back on because you knew that learning to balance was the only way to ride independently. I could have kept running alongside you forever, holding the bike steady so you never fell. But that wouldn't have taught you to ride. It would have taught you to depend on me. Mom, this isn't a children's bicycle. This is our entire life." "Exactly. And you've been riding with training wheels made of my money for 4 years. Never learning to balance on your own, because you knew I'd always be there to catch you. Maybe it's time you learned to ride independently." Michael left that afternoon without saying goodbye, and I haven't spoken to him since. Through Helen's connections, I learned that he and Rebecca sold their furniture to pay for a moving truck and relocated to a rental apartment in Hartford. Michael took a second job at a tax preparation service during filing season. Rebecca found full-time work at a marketing firm. Their marriage lasted 6 months after losing the house. According to Helen, Rebecca filed for divorce, citing, quote, "irreconcilable differences regarding financial priorities and family obligations." She moved back in with her parents and began dating a cardiologist she met through her new job. Michael eventually found a small house in a working-class neighborhood outside Hartford, something he could afford on his actual salary. He's been there for over a year now, and Helen reports that he seems to be building a more sustainable life, though he's struggled with depression and the social isolation that came with losing the Westfield lifestyle. The house in Westfield sold at auction for enough to pay off my mortgage plus legal fees. I donated the surplus to a local organization that provides financial literacy education to young adults, a fitting end to money that had been squandered on people who never learned to manage it responsibly. As for me, I've discovered something unexpected in the aftermath of this family destruction. Peace. My house is quiet, but it's my quiet. My money is my own to spend or save according to my values rather than other people's expectations. My relationships are based on genuine affection rather than financial obligation. I've reconnected with old friends from my teaching years, joined a book club for retired educators, and begun volunteering with literacy programs that remind me why I chose education as my life's work. Last month, I took a 2-week trip to Ireland, something I'd been postponing for years because family obligations always seem to take precedence. The most surprising development has been the people who've reached out to share similar stories. Apparently, my situation isn't as unusual as I'd thought. Across the country, parents and grandparents are struggling with adult children who view family financial support as entitlement rather than gift, who mistake enabling for love and manipulation for family obligation. Many of these people have told me that my decision to enforce consequences inspired them to establish their own boundaries with financially irresponsible family members. A woman in Phoenix stopped paying her daughter's credit card bills. A couple in Seattle refused to refinance their house to pay for their son's third failed business venture. A grandmother in Miami put conditions on her grandchildren's college funding that required them to maintain jobs and budgets. Each of these people faced criticism from family members and friends who believed that family wealth created permanent obligations to fund other people's poor choices. Each discovered that setting boundaries, while painful in the short term, ultimately led to more honest and healthier relationships. I still think about Michael daily, wondering if he's learned the lessons I tried to teach through such a painful process. Part of me hopes he'll eventually understand that my refusal to continue enabling his irresponsibility was motivated by love, rather than vindictiveness. Part of me accepts that he may never forgive me for refusing to pretend that borrowed money equals earned success. But mostly, I've made peace with the fact that loving someone doesn't mean protecting them from the consequences of their choices. Real love sometimes requires letting people fall, so they can learn to pick themselves up. Real family relationships are built on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. This Christmas, I'll celebrate alone again, but by choice rather than exclusion. I'll cook the foods I enjoy, watch the programs I prefer, and spend the holiday according to my own traditions rather than other people's social calendars. There will be no gas station socks under my tree, but there will also be no resentment, no manipulation, and no pretense that money can purchase genuine family connection. At 70 years old, I've finally learned that the most generous thing you can do for someone you love is refuse to subsidize their journey toward becoming someone you can't respect. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give is the gift of consequences, even when those consequences cost everyone involved more than they ever imagined they could afford to pay. The mortgage is paid off. The lesson, I hope, will last a lifetime. Isia. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.